and like, yeah, we're not really set up for hot weather. So yeah, it's starting to cool down now though. So yeah, slightly more comfortable trying to work in this temperature now.
Yeah, must be hard. I hope everyone's safe and just adapting, because I can understand, like, we sort of used to the heat more or less, but yeah, must be that.
Yeah.
So we're sort of live, and for everyone on the call, we have with us Emma Travis, and she's the director of research at Speero. We're absolutely stoked to have her on call today and talk to her. Yes, right. And Emma, you've been in, say, the UX or the CRO space for more than 12 years now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think maybe something like 11 or 12 years. Yeah, that's right. So I've worked mainly agency side for the majority of that time, working with clients, supporting them with research, always kind of in the UX space. So on-site user research primarily, and always, I guess, thinking about, doing that research to help inform some form of website optimization, whether that's A/B testing or website redesigns or whatever it might be. But yeah, that's kind of where I've spent the last few years. Yeah.
Amazing. And when you started off in the industry, were you aware that this is going to blow up? Were you aware this would be such a big thing?
Absolutely not. To be honest, I kind of stumbled across this as a career path. I did a media and communications degree, and in my last kind of year started to move into kind of the digital world a bit. So thinking about like how digital channels were affecting kind of traditional forms of media consumption, which is where I kind of started to take that step, I guess, towards digital. And then managed to kind of get an entry-level graduate job within a digital agency. And literally at that point, I think I actually applied for like a paid search strategy role, not really knowing what that was about. And they actually said to me, oh, based on, your experience and meeting you, we actually think you might be more suited to this kind of research and conversion role. And this was probably the first time I'd ever even heard of what this was. Was offered the job and took it because that's what you do. And kind of remember getting home on my first day after that job and kind of really thinking, actually, this is super interesting. And yeah, that was about 11 years ago. So obviously something resonated with me because I have continued to persevere on that path. But yeah, absolutely had no idea, I suppose, of how important it would become in terms of the overall digital marketing world. So yeah, really happy to see that it's become more of a standard. I think when I started, it was very much like people are putting money into getting traffic on site, but not really thinking about what happens then. We still actually see that now, which is kind of sad, but it's not as frequent now, that kind of attitude. So yeah.
Amazing. It's so interesting that we start off in different places, but like you say, the rest is history, right?
Yeah.
What a great industry to be part of. And so we're super happy to talk to you. And I know that you also sort of, with a research mindset and a scientific mindset, you're so really interested in the psychology and the user research part of it, right? And how has that evolved over the years for you in terms of clearly, like, you're learning on the go, you're learning in an evolving industry. These benchmarks are not set. You're the front runners of really evolving or taking forward the space. How does that feel?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a good question. I guess, it goes from everything in, simple, it starts with like simple user research, I guess, just kind of at a very base level, kind of, usability studies, user testing, like understanding how people are interacting with a website. That was kind of where I kind of sort of almost started, I suppose. Nowadays, and I suppose both with the evolution of the industry and of kind of my career and my knowledge, it kind of spans everything from those more simple kind of research methods to really kind of trying to understand like what are the types of why are we doing this? What are the different types of data that we're trying to uncover by doing this particular research activity? It's not just it's not just about watching people interacting with a website and seeing them struggle with a form. There's a lot more to it than that in terms of trying to understand, like you say, the consumer, the sort of psychology that's going on behind that. And I think, again, that's one of the things that really, I enjoy about the role. Obviously, there's an aspect of the role experimentation that is about kind of quant data, so numbers ultimately. And I've never been like naturally very excited by numbers and maths. But when I think about that being representative of people and actions and behaviors and psychology, then I can start really kind of getting excited about numbers ultimately, which is something I probably thought that I would never really be. So it's about kind of understanding, those behaviors on a larger scale. And I think just to kind of bring it back to your point about how things have evolved, obviously, technology is evolving, and has over the years. So the things that we're able to do now, have increased versus what we could do 11 years ago in terms of, tracking, ability to track, but also different tools that are out there now. I've done a lot of work with eye tracking technology in one of my previous roles, and even kind of, running moderated research where people wear they're called EEG headsets, and they measure like brain activity. So, being able to utilize these different technologies that we have access to nowadays, I guess that's where things start to evolve, back to your original question.
Great, thank you. That sounds, I also like quite a motivation point for someone who doesn't necessarily come from, say, a data-driven background, but they still find this interesting because, you have to find your own why. You have to find what really gets you going. So that's glad you pointed that out, basically. And before we really dive into something, we'd love to know a little more about what do you do when you're not working?
Good question. So she's not actually here today, but you can see her bed in the corner there. I am pretty much a full-time dog mum, very passionate about my role as a dog parent. It's a shame she's not here. Usually on calls, she's like here in the background, and she often says hello to the Speero team, but she's actually at doggy daycare today. So yeah, I'm a dog mum. I'm also quite into kind of fitness. So I do CrossFit and enjoy running and try and keep active. I guess working from home and being a remote team, it's quite easy to end up just being sat in this chair for hours on end. So it's good to get moving when I leave, when I close my laptop. And I also really enjoy traveling. Myself and my boyfriend have recently purchased a camper van.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we're kind of trialing the whole kind of van life. We're not quite digital nomads yet. We still have a house. But yeah, we're enjoying kind of traveling around initially in the UK in the van and exploring there. And then hopefully next year we're going to go over to Europe and do some road tripping there. So that's kind of me outside of work.
Sounds amazing. Living up to the real digital nomad. Getting there.
Slowly, baby steps.
Amazing. Great. So, talking more about, say, e-commerce and sort of diving into what we're going to be focusing on today. And we sort of, post-pandemic, we're in a space where, say, acquisition costs for brands are really high, CAC is skyrocketing. And so paid channels, as so far, earlier, like 5 years ago, if I was starting a brand, I'd be like, let me scale my paid. Today, the story is very different, which is why we're also looking at other ways to grow business, other more sustainable ways. And that's sort of where, the experimentation story also fits in, right? And which is why, the first question is, why is experimentation so important for brands today, specifically in today's world?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really good point that you make. And for me, the main reason why it's so important, now in July 2022, is all about kind of focus and prioritization. So, we talk a lot about, it has different sort of names like spaghetti testing and I've heard it being called peanut butter testing. It's like the idea of just testing random stuff and seeing what works. And I think if we had all of the time and all of the resources in the world, then, you know, okay, that is a strategy. It might not be a good strategy, but eventually you're going to find something that works. Eventually you're going to find, you know, going to learn something, and, you know, you're going to be able to iterate from there, and you'll find something that works. But, you know, we don't have all the time and the resources in the world, right? And to your point, you know, ad spend, you know, is more expensive. It's more difficult to grow in that space from a paid perspective. So when it comes to like, okay, well, how do we make the most of this traffic? How do we optimize our website to make the most of this traffic? We can't be wasting time and resources on trying things that, you know, are completely made up, like guesswork based on assumptions, not based in data. The idea of having a research, you know, first and a data-driven approach is about getting us to the genuine problems, so that our efforts can be put into solving those genuine problems, as opposed to solving problems that we think are problems but actually aren't. And, you know, there's some nuances there. Obviously, research only gets us so far. You know, we need to validate those insights with other methods like A/B testing, experimentation, etc. But it's about really helping us to kind of focus in and prioritize, as opposed, you know, in a world where ultimately we could do so much. I think especially in, you know, ecom, there's just so many, you know, both of my current main clients are e-commerce brands, and it's like there's so much we could be doing, but we can't do everything. So that research, you know, driven approach and data driven approach really helps brands to focus and prioritize ultimately. And I think that's why it's so important nowadays.
I love that. I love that because it's almost like sometimes shooting in the dark, because you know you have a certain percentage that you're going to invest into growing your brand, but if you really don't know like what's the right space, it could be a very hard journey. And prioritization, the way you said that, is so key, right? And could you maybe, in terms of cover prioritization a bit more, you know, for brands when they're thinking of experimentations, or how would they want to go about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I'll briefly talk about the 2 points that I made there. So first of all, focus, and then secondly, prioritization. So focus, I guess the point I want to make here is that, you know, so we have a research methodology called Research Excel. That's kind of, you know, the name of the framework, or the, you know, how you run the research is a slightly different topic. But the reason that for us is very powerful is that what it does is it looks at a relatively top level, but broadly over across a range of different research methods to help us really kind of shine a light on some focus areas. It also, you know, out of that we do get, you know, individual JDIs like this thing is broken, or, you know, these types of things. But really out of that, what we're looking for is, we call them like themes, like research themes or areas of focus. And I think in terms of that, you know, that's why that really helps you to as a starting point to prioritize, you know, from everything to you know, maybe 5 or 6 kind of priority areas. In terms of actual prioritization of the more granular kind of insights and ideas, I guess, and recommendations that come out of the research that we do. So there's loads of different research prioritization frameworks out there. The one that we use is called PXL. There's others like called ICE, you know, all sorts of different ones.
Right.
But ultimately, it's about, you know, having a framework in place, having a consistent framework in place. We think about, you know, impact, evidence, and ease ultimately. So, you know, how likely is this thing to have a big impact? What evidence do we have to support that? And that's really important when it comes to research, to have that sort of built into your prioritization framework. So we have a range of different scores for, like, does it have data within analytics to support it? Did it come from user testing? Did it come from surveys, polls, whatever it might be? Because really, if you're doing research but then not prioritizing based on how much evidence you have,
Right.
then there's kind of a missing link there, right? And then obviously you need to think about ease to help you kind of prioritize the things that are high impact, low effort initially, and then kind of move on to those, maybe those bigger pieces of work. But there's the PI framework as well, which is very, very similar: potential, impact, ease. there's loads of different frameworks out there, but my recommendation would just be like, do a bit of research and ultimately pick one. There's pros and cons of them all, but it's about having a framework. Also, you can adapt them. When I did work in-house, I created my own version of Pi where I changed what I meant, and I fiddled around with it, but ultimately it became a framework that the business used business-wide, and therefore the prioritization framework kind of did its job. So I think the actual specifics of the framework don't matter so much as the sort of act of doing it, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I think, the mindset, for example, really matters. And so, yes, in terms of which framework you choose, which might also be an iterative process versus actually having the mindset to, yes, we need to have a framework, we need to have a process. And I think that's a great point. So, and when we're thinking of, for example, e-commerce brands within the US, like data says, for example, 70% of these brands, they lie between ARR somewhere between $1 million to $5 million annually. And so when you're looking at brands at that scale, because what could be building blocks of an experimentation program for such brands? That's the majority where our D2C really lies. And so you have teams that are not always, very free-handed with resources. You have teams that are, there's like constantly a tussle of where do you invest that money? And so what become like building blocks of an experimental program, like experimentation program for such teams, like distilling? I'm sort of getting you to distill it for us.
So I think that this question really relates to like the maturity of a business in terms of kind of those building blocks. There's a set of building blocks that you need in place in order to effectively run experiments. We offer actually a service that is around helping businesses to identify the gaps in that kind of maturity model and think about that. In terms of the building blocks, I'm trying to think of the right order to do this, and I guess process and methodology is an important starting point. You need to have we talked about like the PXL model, for example. You need these types of things of like, what is the process that we go through? What is the research that we run? But then into like experimentation, what are the artifacts that we need to run an experimentation program? Who does what are the kind of, that's kind of about the cogs, I guess, that happen in the background, the processes and the methodologies. Even things like, how long do we run a test for? How do we know whether something's a test or a JDI? All of these kind of frameworks, it's really important to have that kind of, set. The next one is like, data and tools, because, you need tools to be able to do these things. Like you need ideally things like research tools, whether that's, form analytics tracking, things like Hotjar, things like Userlytics or usertesting.com to run, user research. But then you also need, a testing tool and an analytics platform and all of these kind of different tools. But I think that this is, taking it back to your comment or the way you phrased it, which was building blocks. Right. You can't have, in order to do things effectively, you can't miss one of these pieces of the puzzle. There's two more which I haven't covered yet, but I think that I just have like an example about this one, which is, you can have all of the tools in the world, you can pay for all the fancy tools, but if you don't have the process and methodology and the other two things, which I'll cover in a second, to underpin, the experimentation program, then it's ultimately it will fail. Maybe at first it will feel like it's working, but it won't work in the end. When I did work in house, we kind of had that situation when I started, which was that we had an enterprise level testing tool, but nobody was really doing anything with it. We didn't have buy-in from the business for developers to actually put time into building tests. These types of things that were holding us back from getting the velocity and getting those learnings. So I think that's just like a point back to that whole building block thing. Then on to like people and skills. Like ultimately you need people to do this stuff, at least at the moment. You know, there is still a human aspect. Everything isn't kind of robotic just yet, and automated and these types of things. And the thing yeah, the thing, then I could just go in the van and just be like, yeah, just does it on its own. But I think one of the things to be thinking about there, you know, for these businesses is, and we feel this kind of quite a lot in probably most of the roles that I've had, I have to wear a lot of hats. As somebody that's kind of called like a CRO strategist, or you know, somebody that's kind of got like quite a vague job title like that, you know, we're trying to do like lots of different things. We're having to do, you know, qual analysis, which also sometimes involves like running research with members of the public. So you need to kind of be a people person. At the same time, you need to be able to analyze, you know, quant data, understand statistical significance and p-value and all these types of concepts. You also need to be like slightly creative to help you come up with ideas and solutions. And, you know, I think there's just like a lot of different things that you need to be good at. And you can't really expect one person to be good at all of those things, or at least to be brilliant at all of those things, right? You can have kind of, I guess it's called T-shaped people, right? So people that can do a bit of everything, but have a specialty. Is really what you need to be kind of thinking about when, you know, building those teams. And then the final one in terms of those building blocks is about culture ultimately. You know, you can't, it's really difficult to create an effective experimentation program within a business if you don't have the buy-in, you know, business wide, ideally from the top. You know, you need the right types of people who are, you know, open to being wrong, because experimentation is going to prove that you're wrong sometimes, and that has to be okay. And some people don't like that. And you need to be open to new ideas, and, you know, you need to be open to not doing things based on opinion and all the things we've already talked about. So, and again, like I say, without, you know, any one of those blocks, then at some point the cracks are going to start to show.
That's amazing. That's you know, I love that you put it down like exactly into four of these, because it's important for us sometimes. You know, like thinking of processes come first, like you said, and that's sort of like, you know, the foundation of it all. If I'm not wrong, that's sort of what you said, that you might have investment, but if you don't have the right processes, that might tank, right? And then you're looking at data and attribution, setting that right, and of course, if you don't have the right people to work with, you know, and I love that it's like a multi-pronged approach. You sort of need all the factors to work together to win, right? That's also somehow how we work in e-commerce, because everyone's wearing multiple hats. But if you don't have, you know, a lot of things come together and be right, it's not, you won't lead to growth. So thanks for sharing. That's super important for us to sort of think. We picked up an audience question, and so I think I'll just drop that in first. And one question that came up from Parada is, has user behavior adapted to more mass cookie surveillance or behavior tracking?
Nice question. Yeah, so I think definitely something that we need to be aware of at the moment. And I think this kind of ties back to your question earlier about how things are changing and adapting. You know, I think users in general are more aware of, you know, the fact that they're being tracked, and in some circumstances, you know, are more skeptical of that, you know, maybe are not accepting kind of, you know, cookies and tracking, etc. Meaning that, well, a couple of things. I think what this kind of means is, from an analytics perspective, we need to be aware of the fact that you know, we're not tracking everybody, because there will be people on the site that, you know, have not accepted, you know, those terms and conditions, and therefore aren't being tracked. And therefore, you know, there's kind of a missing piece of the puzzle there. There's a bit of a black hole, I think. And it kind of, in some ways, is scary, you know, with, you know, more laws coming into play around to help, you know, protect users and consumers from a surveillance perspective and these types of things. You know, the idea that we may not be able to track people as effectively in the future is kind of scary in some ways to me. But then in others, it's actually good because, you know, my background, I said before, is in qual data. And I think it just kind of highlights the real importance of using multiple research sources to help. I did a series of posts on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, and I kind of called it like a jigsaw puzzle. Ultimately, that's what we're doing. We're going away and trying to find little bits of the puzzle and kind of put it together to try and create a bigger, you know, the full picture. So I think we just need to be aware that, you know, maybe this literally happened to us. My dog ate a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. So it's kind of like that, where we finished the puzzle and then there was one piece missing. You know, that there is always going to be that. And this kind of, you know, tracking and cookies kind of situation is an example of that. But, you know, are there other ways that you can help plug that gap, maybe with other types of analytics tools, like I mentioned before, like form tracking or heat maps and these types of things that can nicely supplement analytics data, but then also, you know, the role of qual, that's never going to go away, I hope. And therefore, you know, maybe a shift towards more qual methods would help in that circumstance. I hope that
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. You know, we can't really run away from it. And so finding, you know, a way to adapt with that, like, love that. Absolutely. You know, in terms of research, like insights into experimentation, I know that you've spoken enough about like one of your frameworks around ICPs and their motivations, and we sort of love our audience to also hear a little more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I did a workshop on this last week, I think, around kind of ideal customer profiles. And I guess that workshop was kind of more in the B2B space, but a lot of this really applies across. And really, ultimately, this is about understanding your audience, whether that's, you know, B2B, B2C. It doesn't really make a difference. I think the kind of point here is starting to kind of creep into the topic of like segmentation or personalization, and really starting to kind of, you know, run this research. And you know, I mentioned like the research Excel model, that's very top level. But, you know, after we've run that with our clients, then we're starting to run more focused research and identify kind of more like nuances. So difference between key segments. I'm working on a proposal right now for one of my clients, which is specifically around research to help inform a personalization strategy. So this is, you know, we'll run 4 different surveys across 4 different segments. Well, 4 of the same survey, but across different segments. And right. You know, the interesting part is not necessarily the answers to those questions. It kind of is, but it's actually the nuances and the differences between how different segments answer those questions. That's where you start to be able to understand these kind of opportunities really to personalize experiences for different segments based on, you know, their differing motivations, their differing kind of triggers, their differing you know, fears, uncertainties and doubts, as we call them. So it's really just kind of the same situation as running kind of that top level research, but it's just like the step down is like, instead of just guessing what might work for one segment over another, you know, we need to do research to inform that. We do tend to find that like personalization kind of sometimes sits in like a different team or different people. It doesn't always kind of run alongside or within the experimentation program, but it's just the same. It's still a change to the user experience based on an assumption. And ideally that assumption should be based on data in the same way. So.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. There's one more, question from the audience, and I'll just take that, which is, what is a great first question to ask in moderated research? That's by Paul.
Okay, yeah, nice. So I guess one thing I'd mention here, and I don't know how we're doing for time. I talk a lot, so I'm sorry. There's kind of a nuance here. So he has asked, I think, first question. What I would do when I'm running moderated user research is I would always start with what I would call like pre-session questions. But then I'm not sure if what he actually means is what is a great first task. So I'll try to quickly answer both of those questions. So right. In terms of pre-session questions, like the first thing that I would ask is I would ask a really open question about that user's kind of considerations when it comes to purchasing the product. So presuming, you know, today we're talking about e-com. So imagine we're thinking about, I don't know, purchasing a pair of walking boots. I've just made that up. You know, I would want to really understand, you know, what are their considerations when it comes to that purchase? You know, is it about the look of the product? Is it about the, you know, is it some more of the technical aspects? So is it waterproof? Is it comfortable? You know, what are their kind of key considerations when it comes to purchasing that product? And I think the reason why I would include that is, and ideally when you're running moderated research, ideally the user, the participant, would not know the brand that you were about to run the research for. So we want to keep it super open at this point and really just understand their considerations. And what that really allows us to do is to frame some of the feedback that comes when they actually end up on this website that we want to gather feedback onto, because we know what's important to them.
Yes.
So we can kind of say, oh, you know, earlier you explained that it was really important that these shoes were waterproof because you live in a place where it rains a lot, or whatever, you know, and then you can start kind of making sure it helps to, I guess, make the session more realistic in that sense, because you know what their considerations usually are, you know, outside of that website or that particular brand or even the internet. It's just like, in general, you know, what is important to you. And then on that point, in terms of the first task, especially with ecom, I really like to actually just set them off with a really open task, but actually from like a blank browser, or maybe like from a Google page. And the reason for that is, you know, nobody just arrives on a website out of nowhere. There's a journey that happens before you get there. And actually, I've found in the past, you can gather really interesting insight in terms of, you know, how do people even start? Do they use Google Shopping? Do they, you know, how do they pick which, you know, ads they pick from the search results page? Do they click on a paid ad or an organic ad? Do they just go to a website that they know of? You know, so there's some interesting things there, rather than just saying like, here's a website, what do you think? You know, I think there's quite a lot you miss if you don't see that kind of more organic journey to getting them to the website.
Very interesting. In the first case,
oh, I think I've lost you. Hello? Be back.
Yeah.
Oh, I lost you there for a second, I think.
Yeah, no worries. All good now. And yeah, so I was wondering in terms of that, like what's great about the first approach that you mentioned is that on the website, you can actually address user hesitations. For example, once you know the considerations, the user knows they're in the right place because this is what they're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. I think it just helps, you know, one of the things that we have to avoid, or try to avoid, when it comes to like research of any sort, really, is any bias that might happen. And I think anything that we can do to avoid that. So for example, you know, asking them first what's important to them and gathering some, you know, more general insights from them. It's almost like a mini interview before the moderated research that helps the moderator to then go into the sort of task part of the research with more ammunition, I guess is the right word, to make the most of that session, because you kind of have more information about what the mindset that the user would be in genuinely, if that kind of makes sense.
Absolutely. And I also wanted, like, for e-commerce team, for example, what kind of research methods would you recommend? Or maybe what's your favorite research method? We also got that as an audience question. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, anybody that has ever spoken to me about anything to do with research will have heard me kind of talk about moderated user research a lot, mainly because I think I worked for about 3 years at an agency where we literally day in, day out only ran moderated user research. And I just saw kind of all the value that came out of that. back like long before the pandemic was a thing, being in a room with a person and watching them interact with the website, but also having the client like in another room, ideally not next door, but in another room, like observing, and then kind of going into the observation room after the session and just kind of seeing the client like writing loads of stuff down on post-it notes, and like we would do post-it note walls throughout the day, and the amount of stuff that you would have afterwards. Like I think there's lots of different benefits to that moderated activity. That said, it really depends on your objective. Sometimes that doesn't make sense for whatever reason. I think the Research Excel like module, like visual, quite nicely kind of highlights like the type of behavior that you get from each different research method. So like, is it motivational data, which we might get more from like a customer survey? Is it friction-based data, which is more like the user testing type research, etc. And I think really it's about defining your objective, like what you're hoping to find out, and then mapping that to like a type of data, and then mapping that to like, well, what's the best research method to get me that type of data. So my favorite is moderated, the short answer. The long answer is it depends.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that with us. Do you have, we sort of stretched a few minutes ahead, and sorry about that, but do you have anything to say to e-commerce brands just starting off with their experimentation journey?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I talked about this last week on the session I did, but obviously it's good to do things properly, but I would not want people to be put off from getting started when it comes to doing research by thinking that it has to be, an all singing, all dancing, huge piece of work. Yes, that is what we ideally do for our clients. The Research Excel is like 6 weeks. It's, like 25 to 30K. It's a relatively big, piece of work. But if you can't do that for whatever reason, we talked about, things that money and resource and time isn't infinite, especially at the moment. There are things you can do, like literally today or tomorrow, to start doing things. So what I mean by this is utilizing data that already exists within your business, like from an e-com perspective, live chat analysis, listening in on calls, or speaking to call center, customer service representatives. We do something called reviews mining, which is kind of looking through reviews. What are people saying about your brand? What are people saying about your products? Is there, there's some motivational data, but also kind of friction point data within there as well, in terms of what nearly held them back from purchasing a particular product. So outside of kind of gathering all of this new data through surveys and polls and moderated research and these types of things, there's actually like a gold mine of data that already exists within the business. You just have to put, a bit of time and effort into looking for it. So, if you don't have the time and, that etc. money to invest in something like Research Excel, then I would be, starting there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a gold mine of insights, because absolutely love that. This, just talking to you has been great. Like, for me, key takeaways, actually, I come from a bit of a D2C background. I've worked on an e-commerce store, and then now I'm in this space where I'm talking to a lot of different D2C brands. So it's great to understand these things even for myself, like how important is prioritization and focus when you're thinking of experimentation. Also, like, thank you for laying out like those building blocks for us in terms of how do you kickstart an experimentation program, so the brands can understand that, sometimes we feel we're investing into one thing, so we feel this is going to work, but unless you actually, like you said, that it doesn't have to be proper, but if you're thinking of an experimentation program, that sort of model, like the building blocks have to be in place for you to see results, sustainable results over time. So That's fabulous. And yeah, like I think just for brands to remember that they can actually start anywhere. It's also a mindset, it's a process. So if they're not investing that kind of money into, say, going into a full scale, like you said, review mining or customer listening, and those approaches, definitely a great place to start from. So thanks for sharing. This was very insightful for us.
No worries. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the conversation.